On the last episode of the Keepsake box.
Success. What does that mean? Well, I paused the tracker app and drove 5 miles away from the grocery store and 5 miles for the return. I turned the app back on and drove 1 mile out of the way on the return home. If David had actually checked my mileage, he would have noticed that I traveled 10 extra miles. His assertion that I was only 1 mile over had cued me into the fact that he'd relied on the tracker app only, opposed to his assertion that he'd checked my car's odometer. Success. I disabled the phone recorder and called Cream. If David had heard my conversation, he would have referenced it in some way. The narcissism in him would not have allowed him to hold that in. David never told me that he had a recorder on my phone, so he wouldn't have referenced it outright. But I had started to understand how his mind worked. David always wanted me to feel that he was several steps ahead of me. If he had heard my conversation with Cream, he would have mentioned the details in a way that made him look observant and intuitive. If David didn't mention it, it was simply because he was unaware that it existed. But he did reference my conversation with Mandy. And since I had access to the camera app, I was aware that the cameras in the house had no sound. David's awareness that I had talked to Mandy could only be explained by the fact that he had actually listened to the recording. He'd obviously heard my conversation with Mandy, which I wanted him to hear. Yet, he did not hear the bait conversation with Cream, which I didn't want him to hear. Success. I paused the cameras while I cleaned David's bathroom. I unpaused it after I was done, given the perception that I hadn't cleaned it at all. It was obvious that David had watched the camera footage. Had I not properly paused the cameras, David would have seen me cleaning his bathroom. The beating that I received had cued me into the fact that I was able to manipulate the cameras in a way that made David think that I was doing one thing while doing something completely different. Success. That was the day that I learned that I could beat David by letting him think that he was winning. I tempted fate on numerous occasions after that day, but I never again paused the footage during my cleaning. I learned that on that day as well. However painful the experience, phase 1 of the plan was complete, and next it was on to phase 2. Chapter 18, Phase 2, Cream Connection. Narrated by Shandora Warren. I reconnected with Cream. She and I talked on the phone quite a bit. Though there were obvious reasons for me reaching out to her, I realized how much I missed our conversations. Cream and I always played off of each other, and our talks reaffirmed why we had gotten so close in the first place. She was still hilarious, and we bounced off of each other as if we hadn't been separated for years. In talking to her, I realized how superficial my life had been. I'd formulated a strong like for Mandy and Tina, and I obviously wanted what was best for them. But it was different. I loved Cream and Peaches, and they loved me. I know it's hard to understand, considering everything that happened, but it was true. We understood each other on a completely different level. Our conversations were genuine. We were able to speak freely about anything and everything. None of us were ashamed of our lives. When they were down, Antonio and I figured out how to pull them up. We really were like a family. In my new circle, no one could legitimately be genuine. It was impossible. We spent so much time trying to give the perception of perfection that we couldn't ever admit to anything other than what was readily apparent. No one ever admitted to having financial difficulties. Families would go broke and claim to have taken their children out of private school because they wanted them to experience the real world. And I knew from personal experience that wives were abused by their husbands. I wouldn't have ever admitted that to my new circle. On one occasion, David grabbed me and left horrible bruises on my arms. Having social obligations, I couldn't stay home until they were gone. Being Mandy's friend, I should have been able to tell her that I was being abused. I should have been comfortable admitting that to her. But how could I? After everything that I'd said, how could I? Instead, I wore long-sleeve shirts until the bruises were gone. I purchased the most expensive ones that I could find, and I pretended that I was making a bold fashion statement. The crazy thing is, they all followed my lead because I was somebody. There we all were, in the middle of summer, wearing long sleeves. And all because we needed to be a part of something. We all needed to prove that we were more perfect than our peers. That was extremely unfortunate. In talking to Cream, I realized that my circle wasn't mine at all. It was a borrowed space in which I had etched placement. I no longer desired to be in that place, and I was counting on Cream to pull me out, as I had done for her many times. She and I made plans to meet, and we followed through. Although the reconnection was a means to an end, it had certainly been too long since I had seen her face. Phase 2. Cream and I decided to meet on a Wednesday. I turned off the relevant apps and carried on with the plan. I dolled myself up and prepared to meet Cream for lunch, expecting the Cream that I had left behind. She greeted me with a smile and an embrace, a genuine embrace. She said, "You look good, Laga." I wanted to return the compliment, but I found that to be an incredibly difficult task to complete. I just couldn't. Cream was still very nicely shaped, but she looked worn. She looked old. She looked terrible. Cream had dark circles under her eyes, and her hair was pulled up into a ponytail, a very thin one. Her fingernails were bitten down to nubs. When she smiled, I noticed that she had a space between her front teeth that was rotting. Yet, she still had the diamond prominently displayed in her canine tooth. I thought about when I first met Cream and how impressed I was by her. Of course, I was forced to think about Antonio and all the circumstances thereof. I choked back the tears. Cream and I talked about our lives. Initially, I told her a generic version of my life with David. She told me that she was still dancing and bartending on the side. For the first time, I realized that I wasn't the only one that had lost Antonio. I knew where I fell in the hierarchy, and I never doubted that. I did, however, realize that Antonio would not have ever let Cream live that way. She was driving an old beat-up car, and she wasn't wearing any of her signature jewelry. I knew something was wrong, but I decided not to call her on it. It seemed that she was already suffering with whatever she had going on, and I didn't want to add to that. I met with Cream a few more times before I got down to the real reason that I had reached out to her. She and I sat down for lunch, and I started planting the seed. I said, "Cream, what's really going on with you?" I thought I'd have to probe further, but she immediately broke down and started to cry. Cream told me that her life had gone into a downward spiral. She said that she'd started working at a new club and gotten sucked into the underbelly. Cream was always experimental with drugs, as was Peaches, but it was different. When Antonio was alive, he didn't let her veer off too far. And even though Cream wasn't Antonio's number one girl anymore, he was still protective of her. He would have pulled her back, but the new club was different. They weren't a family. Everyone was about their money, including the drug dealers that were basically hired by the club owners. Antonio wouldn't ever have allowed that. I had no choice but to feel a little guilty about her predicament. Peaches' actions had gotten the club burned down, and I had set the stage for that to happen. Drawing a natural correlation, I was forced to feel that Cream wouldn't have drifted so far if she had been amongst family, because that's what Antonio's club was. It was family. Losing the family had placed Cream in a position to intermingle with people who didn't care about her well-being, and I felt awful about that. Cream admitted that she was addicted to drugs and having a hard time pulling herself out of the life. In spite of the obvious guilt that I felt over Cream's predicament, her revelation made my plan so much easier to carry out. But I had to go about it the right way. I realized that every time I tried to fix something for myself, I had put someone I loved in a position to be hurt. I couldn't do that again. I had to be smarter that time. I hugged Cream and told her that I could offer her a way out of her situation. I told her that I could help her, but she had to trust me. And in return, I had to be able to trust her as well. Initially, I hadn't planned on giving Cream the details of my life with David. I was comfortable with telling her the parts that made her feel that I was only attempting to help her. But I realized something. In supplying Cream with the altered version of my life, I was continuing to remain in that place. I was continuing to look the part at all costs, and I didn't want to do that. I needed to be free of the mentality that had caused me to accept less than I deserved. I needed to be free. I told Cream about my real life with David. I started from the beginning and laid it all out on the line. And when I say the beginning, I mean the beginning that started with Antonio's death. For the first time, Cream and I discussed the night that Antonio was killed by Sharon. I told her about Sharon's confession that my relationship with Antonio was initially a setup. Cream sat quietly, but I could tell that she wanted to say something. I saw it in her face. I inquired about her bother, and she broke the box wide open. Cream confessed that she and Peaches were both part of the ploy to bring me in. Cream told me that Antonio had instructed them to do the thing. Apparently, a few girls had been brought into the strip club by Antonio and paired with the women. That had been done for the sole purpose of trapping them. Peaches and Cream would basically glorify the life and in some cases get the women hooked on drugs. They were supposed to do the thing with me. That's why they were always around when Antonio picked me up from work. That's why he often left me alone with them at the club. He was giving them the opportunity to influence me. But according to Cream, the situation had unfolded unlike any other setup. She admitted that Antonio had brought several girls to them, but he hadn't ever slept with any of them. And he hadn't been known to really spend time with them. Basically, he would pick up women who were down on their luck. He would throw them enough money to give the perception that he cared about their well-being. After reeling them in, Antonio would pass them off to Cream and Peaches, who usually completed the process. That's why Cream had offered drugs to me. That was a normal part of the thing. That was the night that I realized Antonio saw me differently. That was the night of the clownfish and anemone conversation. And according to Cream, that's the night they found out he saw me differently as well. After Antonio left my house that night, he informed them that I was off limits. That's when they knew that Antonio was serious about me. A part of me was hurt. It had been years since those things had occurred, but I still felt the sting of betrayal. All things considered, I grew to love them like family, yet they had all conspired against me. The largest part of my heart went back to the night that Antonio died. I remembered how hurt I was that Antonio had initially tried to set me up. I experienced that same hurt in finding out the part that Peaches and Cream played in the situation. But having lost so much, I had a different point of reference. That was the past. No amount of information changed the way I felt about Antonio after he died. I didn't care about the money that I lost after Peaches was killed. And the same was true for Cream. Regardless of how the situation had started out, at some point, love entered the equation. I had no desire to hold on to that. I had no desire to place that hurt into my emotional keepsake box. I had to move on. I told Cream that I wasn't concerned about the past. I just needed to move forward, and I wanted to bring her along with me. I told Cream how I had come to be involved with David. I told her how depressed I was and how David had entered at precisely the right time. I told her about the wonderful life that I shared with him in the beginning. I told her about the cars, the trips, the wedding. I told her about our acquisition of Juanita. And I told her about how it came to be that Juanita was no longer. And finally, I told her about the physical and psychological abuse that I had been suffering at the hands of David. I told her everything. Cream and I both began to cry. She took my hand and addressed me. She said, "You've been going through it, ain't you, little girl?" Cream niece for, "You've been going through it, haven't you, little girl?" I admitted that I had, indeed, been going through it. Of course, we took the opportunity to find the humor in the situation. Cream jokingly said that I needed to call my goons. Surely they would have handled David. That prompted me to get down to the real reason that I had sought her out. I addressed her. I said, "Cream, I need you." And she said, "Whenever you need me to do, little girl." Cream niece, for whatever you need me to do, little girl. I told Cream what I could offer, and I told her what I needed from her. She agreed and promised to follow through with no apprehension. Many people wouldn't rely on the word of a confessed drug addict, specifically one who had admitted to conspiring against them. That went against everything that Antonio had told me. Let's face it, she was a shrimp, a fact of which I was very much aware. But for reasons that I can't explain, I trusted Cream. I had to. We met the next day and Cream came through exactly as she said she would. I told her that we couldn't ever speak of the details of our arrangement again. She agreed and we parted company. And with that, phase 2 was complete. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to follow Shenny Tells a Story on Facebook and Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to purchase books by Shandora Warren, they're all available on Amazon in ebook, paperback, and some in hardback formats. Thank you for helping me to create the world that I want to see. Oh yeah, you're welcome.